Lecture 4, Somaliland. To stand in Hargeisa is to feel the city's memory seared into its streets. There are men here who still hear in their dreams the whine of a MiG-17 diving to level a neighborhood in 1988. A war memorial in the city center displays one of those Soviet-supplied fighter jets impaled on a pedestal. Lethal grammar turned into punctuation of an era. The regime of Mohammed Syed Barre had chosen to make Hargeisa an example, bombarding its own citizens with such ferocity that roughly 90% of the city was destroyed and more than 40,000 people were killed in that onslaught. Entire families fled on foot into the desert with whatever they could carry. Nearly 300,000 refugees poured across the border into Ethiopian camps in 1988-89. They remember the taste of foreign milk powder in those tents and the way the wind erased their footprints as if to hide the humiliation of retreat. An entire generation's childhoods began with exile. The bones of the dead still surface after heavy rains in dry riverbeds that locals grimly call the Valley of Death, where over 200 mass graves from the late 1980s are believed to lie. In 2001, a UN investigation formally concluded that Barre's campaign against the Azark clan in Somaliland constituted genocide. These scars are not just metaphor, they are numbered in graves and refugees, MiGs and bombs, dates and data. Between 1987 and 1989, an estimated 200,000 civilians were massacred in Somalia's north, a crime so vast that the world's conscience, preoccupied by Cold War calculations, scarcely registered it at the time. Out of that sonic and human wreckage, Somaliland willed itself into being. In May 1991, as Somalia's central state collapsed under the weight of its own cruelties and clan rebellions, local leaders in the northwest gathered in the town of Burao. With Somali National Movement fighters and elders in conference, they declared that the Republic of Somaliland would reclaim the sovereignty it had briefly held in 1960. The name was not chosen in provocation but in continuity, a restoration of the nation that had existed for a few days after colonial rule. They re-raised the same flag that had flown on June 26, 1960, when the British Somaliland Protectorate first gained independence. On that summer day, embassies in far-off capitals sent polite notes of recognition. A new national anthem played in Hargeisa's sun-soaked streets. 5 days later, Somaliland's leaders entered a hasty union with the newly independent Trust Territory of Somalia, former Italian Somalia, to form the Somali Republic. It was a marriage born in optimism, two territories becoming one Somalia, answering the pan-Somali dream of uniting all 5 points of the ethnic star. But the ink was barely dry before fractures showed. The Act of Union that was supposed to formally legalize the merger was never ratified by Somaliland's assembly, and the version passed in Mogadishu's parliament differed from the northern text. In legal terms, the union was an attempt that failed to meet the basic requirements of treaty law. In Somaliland's view, it never ceded its sovereignty in 1960 because the required procedures were not completed. Decades later, a 2005 African Union fact-finding mission acknowledged this shaky legal foundation, noting that the Union was never ratified, and that Somaliland's quest for recognition is a special case that should not be seen as opening a Pandora's box of secessions. History had left an exit door ajar, and in 1991 Somaliland's people chose to walk through it. What followed the 1991 declaration was even more remarkable than the declaration itself. In place of chaos or civil war, the northwestern clans embarked on an indigenous peace-building process that would become a quiet legend. Where the world's headlines expected warlords and gunmen, Somaliland offered elders conferences and clan assemblies. The new polity had to be stitched together from the fragments of a traumatized society. Azark, Gadabursi, Hati, Dayrod and others who had all bled under the old regime. The work of stitching fell to the Zir, the customary law carried in elders' memories, and to the dear-paying groups that bind lineages into collective responsibility for blood debts. Somaliland's social fabric had one great advantage: it had been mended before. For centuries, clans here resolved conflicts under the acacia trees, in councils called shah, where grievances were aired until consensus, or at least a tolerable truce, was achieved. This time, the stakes were existential. Vengeance for the genocide could have easily rent the region into endless clan feuding. Instead, elder mediators from various clans invoked Zir like a protective charm. Murder would be answered not by revenge killings but by compensation payments of camels and cash meticulously agreed upon, hard arithmetic spoken over tins of sweet milk and cups of tea, as the original lecture put it. A council of elders known as the Gorti emerged as the spine of the new state, adapting the traditional role of clan seniors into a national institution. These grey-bearded arbiters sat in endless circles, insisting that grudges be settled with dialogue and payments rather than with bullets. Your clan pays this many camels, ours pays this many dollars and regrets. The mothers nod, the boys are told to sit down, and somewhere in that quiet compromise, a state found its foothold. One of the pivotal gatherings took place at Barama in 1993, an event that deserves its place in any textbook on nation building. In that small town, roughly 2,000 delegates, elders, militia leaders, religious scholars, business people, convened for nearly 5 months of deliberation. The air was thick with both incense and argument. Every clause of governance was debated in tents and meeting halls late into the night. Delegates came armed not with rifles but with proverbs and ledgers. The result was a new social contract, a national charter that blended modern republican institutions with traditional authority. They agreed to an interim power-sharing structure, a civilian president to replace the SNM military leadership, an elected House of Representatives, and a role for the Ghouti as an upper house of elders to keep the temperature sane in the young republic. Power transferred peacefully. Abdirahman Ahmed Ali, Tor, the SNM chairman who had served as Somaliland's first interim president from 1991, stepped aside gracefully when the elders elected Mohammed Haji Ibrahim Eagle as the new president in 1993. Eagle, a veteran politician who, coincidentally, had been Prime Minister of Somalia in the 1960s, set to work turning revolutionary fervour into government institutions. Meetings were held in old British colonial-era buildings and, under thorn trees alike, a cabinet was formed even if it met sometimes in a tent with a teapot at hand. The treasury was literally a physical ledger in those days, and the central bank was whatever lockbox could hold the trickle of tax shillings available. It was state building at its most basic, penny by penny, elder by elder, reconciling yesterday's wounds to make room for tomorrow. In 1997, another grand conference in Hargeisa extended Eagle's mandate and refined the governing charter, paving the way for a permanent constitution. After several more years of hammering out details, a decade of conferences in total, Somaliland held a constitutional referendum in May 2001. The question posed to the people in that vote was simple and momentous: do you approve of the constitution affirming Somaliland's independent statehood? The answer came loud and nearly unanimous. 97% of voters said yes. It was a startling mandate. International observers noted the turnout and the seriousness of the voters standing in long dusty queues, even though no country would officially recognize the referendum's outcome. With that vote, Somalilanders, as they often call themselves, asserted unambiguously that they were, in their own minds and hearts, already a nation. The new constitution formalized the hybrid system, a bicameral parliament with an elected House of Representatives and an elders Ghouti as the Senate, an executive presidency, and an independent judiciary. It also entrenched Islam as the religion and Zir as a source of law alongside modern statutes. The delicate braid of old and new was thus written into law. Somaliland's state had been born twice, once by armed struggle and once by ballot, and it now had a legal scaffolding to match its social one. To stand in Hargeisa now is to feel both the scorch marks and the stitchwork of that history. The city front-loads its pragmatism. On one corner stands a traffic circle with a fighter jet on a pedestal, the very MiG-17 that once rained death, now a monument that children play under. On another corner, goats clamber around a roundabout adorned with a statue of the late President Eagle, whose visage you see on Somaliland's banknotes and in street murals. That juxtaposition, war memory and nation-building pride, captures Somaliland's mood, unsentimental, unflinching, and forward-looking. Hargeisa today is a bustling capital of perhaps 1 million people. No formal census exists, but the city has swelled with returnees and new families since the war. The downtown is a hive of small businesses, money exchange kiosks decorated in colorful hand-painted signs, storefronts selling everything from cat to smartphones. There are almost no traffic lights. Instead, informal choreography and the occasional goat herd determine the flow. Government offices occupy repaired colonial-era buildings and new blocky constructions with flags flying out front. In the presidential compound, an old Somali flag star reportedly still hangs in a museum, a reminder of the union that was and wasn't. If you arrive in Hargeisa expecting a bleak war-torn provincial town, you'll be immediately corrected by reality. By the 2000s, Somaliland had rebuilt an impressive degree of normalcy entirely by its own hands and with diaspora help. The markets are crowded with traders and shoppers, the schools and universities are open, the country boasts over 30 universities and colleges today, astonishing for a place that had none in 1991. Elections are held regularly or as regularly as the rough edges of politics allow. In 2002, Somaliland held its first local council elections, followed by a presidential election in April 2003 that was decided by a mere 80 votes out of nearly 500,000 cast. The incumbent, President Dahir Riali Karin, won by just 0.01%, one of the slimmest margins in history. Tensions ran high. The opposition, led by Ahmed Solanio of the Kulmi Party, initially cried foul and there were a few days of protests. But after the Supreme Court upheld the results, Solanio accepted defeat, and Riali was sworn in for a new term. It was a democratic miracle in miniature, a handover of power through ballots, not bullets, in a breakaway state with no official friends. International observers from Europe and Africa, who had quietly come to witness the vote, called it a milestone of democratic maturity. In 2005, Somaliland held its first parliamentary elections, again largely peaceful and competitive. By 2010, the opposition leader Solanio finally won the presidency in another smooth transfer, and in 2017, Musa Bihi Abdi, a former Air Force pilot and guerrilla commander, was elected president. By this time, Somaliland had seen multiple changes of leadership through the ballot, something many far wealthier African states struggle to achieve. Most recently, in November 2024, opposition candidate Abdiarham Mohamed Abdullahi, Iro, won the presidency with 64% of the vote, unseating President Bihi in a landslide. Observers hailed it as another remarkable first, an incumbent defeated decisively and conceding gracefully in a Horn of Africa election. Leaders from neighboring countries, including the President of Djibouti and even the President of Somalia, which officially does not recognize Somaliland's government, sent congratulations to Iro on his victory. Somaliland's political culture messy, at times delayed or contentious, but fundamentally oriented toward consensus and peaceful rotation of power, had once again asserted itself. That political culture is deeply rooted in Somaliland's social conventions. Consider the role of the Goti, the Council of Elders, which is a unique institution in modern governance. These are unelected senior clan figures who sit in Parliament's upper house, initially given the mandate to maintain peace and arbitrate disputes. They have been criticized for long terms and opaque decision-making. Indeed, many Goti members have served for decades now, but time and again, when a national crisis loomed, it was the Goti that summoned all parties to a figurative, and sometimes literal, campfire and talked them down. For example, when presidential elections were delayed amid disagreements in 2009, it was the Goti that brokered a deal for a few extra months and calmed the streets. The Goti's existence has drawn both praise and frustration. Praise because it embodies a culturally resonant method of consensus building, and frustration because at times it has extended mandates of officials without election, leading the opposition to accuse it of being an undemocratic rubber stamp. Both can be true. Somaliland's system is not a polished utopia but an improvised hybrid, working by trial and error. And yet, the alternatives tried. Elsewhere in the region, pure military rule, or clan militia rule, or imported Western models without local buy-in, have all fared far worse. As one Somali saying goes, rags are better than an empty closet. Somaliland's imperfect institutions are at least theirs, woven from native cloth, and they have delivered stability where grander schemes failed. The customary law Zir remains active at the village and neighborhood level, handling everything from land disputes to marriage negotiations. Meanwhile, statutory law operates in courts that base their rulings on a mix of Somaliland's laws, often adapted from Somalia's 1960s laws, and Sharia for personal matters. It's a legal braid of three strands: Zir, custom, Sharia, religion, and civil law, each holding the others in balance. Many outsiders assumed this arrangement would collapse into contradiction, but for nearly 3 decades it has proven surprisingly resilient, flexible in practice, if not always neat on paper. If there is one arena where Somaliland's statehood is most tangible to its citizens, it is the economy. The economy does not wait for poets to finish, an observer once quipped. At dawn, long-haul livestock trucks groan out of the interior toward the ports, piled high with bleating cargo. By mid-morning, the customs officers at Togwajale, on the Ethiopian border, are improvising an ethics under corrugated iron canopies, deciding how much tax to levy on a given truckload with scant guidance beyond common sense. In Berbera, Somaliland's historic port on the Gulf of Aden, gigantic new cranes pinch the sky, pale blue steel sentinels courtesy of Dubai's DP World, which in 2016 signed a $442 million deal to transform Berbera into a regional container hub. Those cranes arrived in 2018 and 2020 like alien visitors, towering over the old Soviet-era gantries that once handled modest flows of goods. Now they swing containers from ship to shore with clockwork precision. The first phase of DP World's expansion, including a 400-meter new quay and a 55-foot deep berth, was inaugurated in June 2021. It boosted Berbera's capacity from just 150,000 TEUs to 500,000 TEUs, 20-foot equivalent units, per year. To imagine it, on a good morning you can stand at Berbera's lookout and count hundreds of colorful containers stacked like Lego bricks, waiting to be trucked down the Berbera corridor, the highway stretching west to Ethiopia, where they will feed one of Africa's fastest growing populations. A new 240 kilometers asphalt road from Berbera to the Ethiopian border, financed by a consortium including the UAE's fund and the UK's development agency, was completed around 2021. That road turned what used to be a bone-jarring desert track into a smooth artery. It is a geometry problem with invoices attached. Every additional ton that can be moved efficiently is a ton that strengthens Somaliland's economic argument for existence. And what is that economy? In a phrase, a camel's spine propped up by a diaspora's love and a merchant's ingenuity. Livestock is the backbone, not metaphorically but literally the main export. In the traditional Somali way, wealth is measured on 4 legs. Somaliland's herders export millions of head of sheep, goats, and cattle every year to the Arabian Peninsula, following rhythms as old as the monsoon winds. During the Hajj season, the flow peaks as the Saudi market hungers for sacrificial animals. The port of Berbera comes alive with bleating choirs as ship after ship is loaded with livestock bound for Jeddah. It's a trade that dates back centuries, but it faced a mortal scare in the late 1990s when Saudi Arabia imposed a ban over disease fears. In 1998 to 2000, a Saudi-led ban on livestock from the Horn, due to Rinderpest and Rift Valley fever outbreaks, nearly choked Somaliland's economy. Overnight, the price of a goat plummeted, thousands of camels that would have been sold for export suddenly had no market, and pastoralist families' income dried up. Somaliland learned the hard way what it means to have your economic artery pinched by a fax from Riyadh. The ban was eventually lifted after improved veterinary controls, but not before Somaliland invested in quarantine stations and veterinary labs to certify its animals as disease-free. Even today, whenever whispers emerge of another Gulf import ban, as happened intermittently in the 2000s and 2010s whenever a rumor of disease surfaced, officials in Hajjiza scrambled to send delegations and lab reports to Gulf capitals to keep the trade open. The lesson was clear: diversify or die. An economy cannot live by goats alone. Diversification, to the extent it has happened, came partly via the diaspora lifeline. Somaliland has an enormous diaspora community. By some estimates, over 1 to 2 million Somalilanders live abroad, from London to Minneapolis to Melbourne. Starting in the 1980s and especially after 1991, this diaspora became the country's biggest investor and donor rolled into one. Remittances from Somalilanders abroad are estimated at anywhere from $500 million to $1 billion annually, dwarfing any other form of foreign income. Back in 2008, diaspora remittances were about $450 million a year, sustaining millions in the breakaway republic. Today the government claims the figure is much higher, even fantastically high. In 2022 the Somaliland government cited a GDP of roughly $7 billion, most of which comes from remittances, a number that likely includes informal flows and perhaps some optimistic accounting. What is certain is that every month, money transfer companies like Dahabshil, a homegrown firm that spans 126 countries, and its competitors move the equivalent of entire family budgets into Somaliland's towns and villages. These remittances pay for food, school fees, hospital bills, and the construction of countless little villas with bright paint and tin roofs. It has been said that without remittances, Somaliland would starve, and this is not far from literal. In a poignant way, the diaspora has functioned as Somaliland's de facto development agency and central bank. During droughts, dollars from Boston and Oslo keep people alive. When a new business idea needs seed money, a cousin abroad wires it. In Hajjiza, you can visit the offices of Dahabshil and see people queuing with ID cards to pick up $100 sent from a relative in Europe, money to cover a wedding or buy a used Toyota for a taxi venture. Remittances made up an estimated 4 times the value of livestock exports by the late 1990s, essentially rescuing Somaliland's economy during the livestock ban crisis. To this day, they remain a cornerstone. The government knows this well. In 2014, for instance, the tax on cat, a mildly narcotic leaf imported from Ethiopia, contributed 20% of the government's entire budget. And that tax is effectively paid with remittance money because locals buy cat with the cash relatives send. Somaliland families have become experts at stretching $100 into a month's sustenance, balancing local pastoral incomes with diaspora inflows in a delicate dance of survival economics. Yet Somaliland is not content to live forever on herding and handouts. Perhaps its greatest innovation in the past 2 decades has been in the financial sector, specifically, mobile money. In the late 2000s, as Kenya's famous M-Pesa was transforming banking next door, Somalilanders took a step further. In 2009, a local telecom called Telism launched ZAD, a mobile money service, and within a few years Somaliland's economy leaped from a cash-based informal system to a digital one. Today, every trader in Hargeysa's market, every taxi driver, even beggars on the street, will readily accept payment by mobile phone. You can buy a cup of tea or a bunch of onions by dialing a few digits on a basic cell phone, no smartphone or internet needed. It works by simple USSD code. The penetration of mobile money is astounding. Over 80% of adults use it, by some estimates, effectively turning Somaliland into one of the most cashless economies in Africa. Prices in shops are often listed in dollars, but no physical dollars change hands. Instead, customers transfer the equivalent via ZAD or its competitor, Hormude's e-Dahab service. The Somaliland shilling, SLS, still circulates, especially in rural areas and for small change, but it's awkward. The largest note is 5,000 SLS, worth barely 50 cents, so one needs bricks of notes for larger purchases. Consequently, people have gravitated to mobile balances in shillings or US dollars. As one economist quipped, cash here sweats, but phones purr. The Central Bank of Somaliland, to its credit, hasn't fought this digital revolution, it even promotes it as a sign of modern finance. Of course, Somaliland's shilling is not an internationally recognized currency, you won't find it on ISO lists. Printed in batches often without robust backing, it has suffered inflation. On the streets, prices often wink in 3 currencies, shillings, US dollars, and mobile e-dollars, and everyone just adapts. Trust is not derived from any IMF program or formal bank guarantee, but from the lived reality that last week's transactions cleared and so will this week's. The private sector's ingenuity and the public's willingness to embrace new tech have effectively created a functional financial system out of thin air. This system handles an estimated $2 billion of transactions per year, facilitating commerce in a place with barely any formal banking. It is common to see traders at the end of the day settling accounts by punching numbers into a Nokia phone, reconciling who owes whom in a web of trust that would make any Wall Street banker's head spin. Somalia's shilling collapsed in the 90s and the Somali franc, issued briefly in the Civil War, is forgotten, but Somaliland's own shilling has persisted, buttressed paradoxically by the ubiquity of the US dollar and the embrace of mobile money. Another quiet backbone of the economy is one of the world's oldest traded commodities, frankincense. In the lofty hills of Sanag region, particularly around Mount Dalolo and toward Erigavo, grow groves of the fabled Boswellia sacra trees. These gnarled trees cling to cliff faces, their bark deliberately cut by skilled harvesters who then collect the using resin tears. The resin, once hardened into golden droplets, is sorted into grades with poetic names, Maidi being the finest. Somaliland's frankincense has perfumed pharaohs' chambers and Vatican altars. Even today, a good portion of global frankincense, as well as myrrh, comes from these mountains. It's said that you can smell Sanag before you see it. The air carries hints of citrus and pine from the resin, an aroma of ancient holiness. Entire villages in Somaliland's highlands make their living from this trade, climbing perilous heights to tap the trees. The economy of St. here is also an ethics of sustainability. Overtap the trees or introduce too many middlemen in fast cars, and yields drop as the trees sulk from the abuse. So the harvesters follow a rhythm set by tradition. Each tree gets its rest, each cut is spaced in time. Frankincense doesn't rival livestock or remittances in sheer monetary value, but it is a significant export, several $1 million a year, and an identity marker. Somaliland is literally frankincense land. In ancient texts, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea mentions it. Global companies have started to eye this resource. There is talk of fair trade frankincense to ensure harvesters aren't exploited. Meanwhile, on the ground, traders in Berbera's old market still haggle over sacks of olibanum resin as if they were sacks of wheat, and the smell of burning frankincense wafts through every home during Eid celebrations. The daily lifeblood of Somaliland's towns, however, often comes down to a stimulant, cat, or Kuwait in Somali. Every afternoon, the nation turns over a new leaf, literally. The cat trade illustrates the fine line between economics and social fabric. Plane loads of cat leaves arrive each day from Ethiopia, freshly harvested in the morning in the highlands of Hara or Sidamo, then flown to Hargeisa by midday to meet ravenous demand. By 2 p.m., cities like Hargeisa and Bako start to slow down as many adult men settle in for an afternoon chew, gathering in circles to converse languidly as the amphetamine-like effects of the leaf seep in. In a Hargeisa kiosk, you'll find a woman in a cloud-colored gabi shawl, selling bundles of cat tied with twine. Her fingertips are stained green from handling the shrub's tender leaves. The price of cat fluctuates like a stock index, responding to supply hiccups or security issues. When a border closure or delayed cargo causes a cat shortage, the city grows visibly tense and irritable, humor evaporates from conversations, tempers flare. Then the next shipment arrives and, as one economist dryly described, consumption's smoothing occurs, equilibrium and sociability are restored. The government both benefits from and is troubled by this trade. Cat is legal and taxed. As noted, it made up a huge chunk of budget revenue at points. Somaliland spends an estimated $524 million a year, roughly 30% of its GDP, on importing cat from Ethiopia. This is an incredible figure, a leakage of national wealth that one former finance minister lamented as chewing up our future. Yet banning cat is politically impossible. Too many livelihoods, farmers, transporters, vendors, depend on it, and it has become woven into the social rhythm. So the state takes its cut via import duties and tries half-hearted public health campaigns to warn of cat's effects. Meanwhile, in the late afternoons, even ministers and mayors often disappear for cat break. The cynical joke is that Somaliland's development plan each day ends at 2 p.m. when the cat arrives. But there's another way to view it. Those communal chewing sessions, although economically unproductive, also serve as informal forums where ideas are exchanged, disputes settled, and consensus formed at the grassroots level. In that sense, cat sessions are an extension of the shur, with less formality and more green leaves. One must also note the gender aspect. Chewing remains largely a male domain. Women often bear the brunt, financially and socially, as they manage households while husbands are off in stupor. Despite all these local idiosyncrasies, Somaliland's economy has been growing. The official GDP is hard to pin down, being unrecognized means no regular World Bank assessments until recently. In 2012, the World Bank estimated Somaliland's GDP at around $1.4 billion, with a per capita of about $347. By 2020, Somaliland's own statistics office claimed GDP had grown to $2.9 billion, and by 2022 the government was touting a figure of $7 billion, which likely is an overestimation or perhaps a PPP figure. Realistic independent analyses put the GDP in the range of $3 to $4 billion in recent years, with per capita income around $700–800. That still makes it one of the poorest places in the world, but notably it is about 2 to 3 times higher per capita than Somalia proper, reflecting the relative stability and better governance. The government's annual budget has grown steadily, from a shoestring $20 to $30 million in the 1990s to about $40 million in 2008. Reaching $250 million by 2018, and about $550 million by 2025. This is still minuscule by global standards, roughly the budget of a mid-size American city's school system, but for Somaliland it has meant being able to pay a civil service, maintain security forces, and invest in some public works without relying on direct foreign aid. An illustrative comparison: in 2008, Reuters noted Somaliland's budget was $40 million, what the US government spent every 6 minutes at the time. Now Somaliland collects over $500 million in revenue, a sign of a growing private sector and improved tax collection at ports and borders. Still, the government frequently stresses how handicapped it is by lack of recognition. No access to international loans or grants from the IMF, World Bank means development projects must rely on what domestic revenue and diaspora goodwill can furnish. President Musa Bihi Abdi wrote in 2018 that being shut out of international markets compounds the socio-economic pressures the country faces. Indeed, foreign direct investment remains limited to niche projects like DP World's port, because most investors balk at pouring money into a territory that, on paper, is still part of conflict-ridden Somalia where contracts could be contested by Mogadishu. Yet Somaliland has managed some public infrastructure achievements that would be the envy of more recognized states. A telling example is in basic municipal services, garbage collection, water supply, electricity. Somaliland's leaders often point out that while Mogadishu's government struggled to control a few city blocks, Somaliland authorities paved roads, built schools, and even improved utilities in their territory. Hargeisa's water system, for instance, was upgraded with a new pipeline from Jeed Debel Reservoir, doubling the city's water supply by the late 2010s. It was not a flashy project, but crucial. Hundreds of kilometers of plastic pipes now bring clean water to neighborhoods that used to rely on donkey carts. Similarly, Berbera built a proper sewage treatment site and landfill for waste management in 2019, ending the practice of dumping trash on beaches. These sound like mundane accomplishments: drains, culverts, garbage trucks, but, as one local commentator wryly noted, the low pros of sovereignty is often what separates functional states from failed ones. Indeed, you can gauge a government's health by whether an official can answer a question about garbage collection without squinting as if insulted. In Somaliland, many officials can give such an answer, and might even proudly show you the new fleet of bright orange rubbish trucks donated by international partners or bought with municipal funds. Electricity remains mostly private generator driven, but there have been investments in microgrids and solar. In some cities like Berbera and Hargeisa, independent power providers have merged their networks to create minigrids, lowering prices. Solar panels glint on rooftops more and more, feeding into the patchy grid and signaling a tentative modernization. On a typical evening, the lights might flicker, but they stay on long enough for students to study and businesses to stay open past dusk, a vast improvement from the pitch-dark nights of the war years. All these small developments add up to an environment where Somalilanders increasingly feel they have something to lose, a normal life to protect, which in turn reinforces the commitment to peace. If normal life is one side of the coin, the other side is the extraordinary efforts to maintain normal life against many odds. Somaliland has faced droughts, floods, locust plagues, you name it, in just the past decade. Climate change is hitting the Horn of Africa hard, and Somaliland, with an economy so dependent on rain-fed pastoralism, is acutely vulnerable. In 2016 to 2017, a severe drought wiped out 70% of livestock in some areas, turning once proud nomads into climate refugees dependent on food aid. In May 2018, Cyclone Sagar, the strongest tropical cyclone ever recorded in Somaliland, barreled into the coast with 120 km/h winds. The authorities estimated 50 people died in that storm in the Awdal region, with torrential rains delivering a year's worth of precipitation in a single day. Dry riverbeds that hadn't seen water in decades suddenly became raging torrents, sweeping away villages. Aid agencies later noted that what used to be considered a once-in-a-century event might become more frequent. Somaliland's nascent disaster response agency, grandly named NADFA, National Disaster Preparedness and Food Reserve Authority, struggled to respond, hampered by meager resources. The government budget for disaster response is tiny, and international aid must be routed through UN agencies since Somaliland isn't a UN member. Still, local volunteers and diaspora-funded charities filled some gaps. The lesson of Sagar, as one official put it, is still being metabolized. People realized the climate is no longer playing by old rules. In 2019 to 2020, swarms of locusts darkened Somaliland skies, part of the worst regional locust plague in decades. Farmers and herders watched in despair as these obscene hunger hoppers devoured grazing lands. Somaliland had to plead with the international community for planes to do aerial spraying. Eventually a regional effort managed to contain the worst, but not before thousands of hectares were stripped bare. A quip made the rounds in Hargeisa that Somaliland's air force consists of crop duster planes hunting locusts, a bittersweet joke of sovereign responsibility in action. Each crisis underscores that Somaliland's statehood, while functional, is fragile. It copes by building resilience, water reservoirs here, vaccination campaigns for livestock there, and by budgeting prudently. Somaliland's finance ministry, for instance, consciously sets aside some reserve every year for drought relief, knowing it will come sooner or later. And the people, for their part, have a tradition of community pooling, Ayakso, named after the small rains, coming together in lean times. In 2019, when the locusts hit, youth groups in some towns organized themselves to manually clear bush and kill locust egg masses, buying time until chemical spraying arrived. These responses might seem quaint compared to a well-funded national disaster agency, but they often made the difference on the ground. One area where Somaliland's state has arguably overachieved is internal security. While southern Somalia was mired in fighting warlords and later the Al-Shabaab insurgency, Somaliland enjoyed relative peace. It wasn't entirely untouched by terrorism. In October 2008, suicide bombers linked to Al-Shabaab struck the presidential palace, the Ethiopian Trade Mission, and the UN office in Hargeisa, killing 24 people. That was a wake-up call. Since then, Somaliland's security forces, often with quiet support from Western partners like the UK, improved their counter-terrorism capacity. Today, Hargeisa is considered one of the safest cities in the region, with crime rates lower than many African capitals and a generally cooperative population that views the police as part of the community. Piracy, which exploded off Somalia's coast in 2008 to 2011, never took root in Somaliland's waters. Local coastal communities, working with authorities, made it clear they wouldn't tolerate pirates using their coves, and Somaliland's Coast Guard, tiny but persistent, arrested some would-be pirates, handing them to the makeshift courts. International naval missions that operated in the Gulf of Aden quietly appreciated this stability. Berbera became a preferred port of call for resupplying anti-piracy patrols. It's an irony that while Somaliland isn't recognized, foreign militaries have indirectly dealt with it for practical reasons, e.g., NATO ships have docked at Berbera during anti-piracy operations, through arrangement with local authorities, though officially, coordination is said to be via the Somali federal government. Similarly, on counterterrorism, Somaliland has at times shared intelligence with neighboring Ethiopia and even the United States, acting as a northern anchor of stability against Al-Shabaab infiltration. These are the unspoken quasi-diplomatic engagements that happen in the shadows of non-recognition. Yet, for all its internal success, Somaliland exists in a strange diplomatic purgatory, a functioning state that haunts the international system like a polite ghost. It fulfills the classical criteria for statehood set out by the 1933 Montevideo Convention: a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, and the capacity to enter relations. Indeed, Somaliland insists it meets these criteria in spades and has done so for years. It controls roughly 137,600 square kilometers of territory, about the size of England and Wales, within the borders of the former British Protectorate. It governs approximately 4 to 5 million people, though some estimates now go as high as 6 million with population growth. It has a capital city, Hargeisa, where a president sits in office and issues orders that are actually followed. It prints its own currency, issues its own Somaliland passports, which, while not broadly recognized, are accepted by a few countries in the region for travel. It has its own military, flag, and national anthem. By Montevideo standards, Somaliland is a state. But international recognition is the alchemy that turns the de facto state into a de jure one, and that alchemy remains elusive here. Recognition, as legal scholars often note, is not purely declarative, just acknowledging an existing fact, nor purely constitutive, magically creating statehood where none existed. It is a bit of both, and it requires reciprocity. A state isn't a state unless others treat it as such. Sovereignty is like electricity, it needs a circuit completed by others. The coin of the realm is reciprocity. Somaliland sends out emissaries, but without recognition they're like radio signals with no receiver on the other end. There is a Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Hargeisa, and it has offices, quasi-embassies, in London, Addis Ababa, Washington, and elsewhere, but officially these are liaison, or trade, offices, since calling them embassies would offend host nations' adherence to Somalia's sovereignty. This yields scenes almost tragicomic. Somaliland's foreign ministers over the years have crisscrossed African capitals and met dignitaries in private backrooms, always receiving respectful nods and sometimes praise for their democracy, yet not one country will say the word recognize. They all fear the precedent. If Somaliland, why not Puntland, why not Biafra, why not Casamance, why not Scotland or Texas for that matter? The African Union has long had a stance, stemming from a 1964 Cairo resolution, that colonial borders are inviolate. Somaliland's very argument, ironically, is that it is sticking to colonial borders. It seeks a return to the British Somaliland outline, not a new tribal carve-up. Many African states privately agree Somaliland is a unique case. The AU's 2005 mission even stated as much, saying Somaliland's case is historically unique and self-justified, and should not be seen as opening a Pandora's box for other secessions. The mission recommended the AU find a special method to deal with Somaliland's aspiration. Yet in the 18 years since, the AU has done effectively nothing. It's politically paralyzed. Recognizing Somaliland would upset Somalia, a member state, and countries like Nigeria or Cameroon worry it could encourage their own separatists. So the result is a diplomatic limbo where Somaliland exists and does not exist at the same time. The United Nations doesn't admit it as a member, but UN agencies operate in Somaliland and even sign agreements with the Somaliland authorities, carefully worded to not say government. The World Bank and IMF cannot lend directly to Hargeisa, but they have started including Somaliland in some aid programs via Somalia's federal government or through trust funds. In one absurd instance, Somaliland had to send its Health Minister to an international conference as part of the Somali delegation, even though Somaliland has not been under Mogadishu's control for decades. The minister wore a badge that said, Somalia, sat quietly through discussions about our country's situation, and then delivered a separate briefing about Somaliland's health programs as if it were just a particularly autonomous province. Somaliland's officials often say they face a pseudo-embassy ballet each week. They host visiting delegations from various countries who can't officially acknowledge the host as a country. For example, the European Union and several Western nations sent election observers to Somaliland's 2017 presidential vote, praising the territory's commitment to democracy, but they made sure to clarify this didn't imply recognition. The United Kingdom, Denmark, and others have denied asylum to Somaliland refugees on the grounds that Somaliland is safe enough to return to, even as those same governments insist that Somaliland is legally part of war-torn Somalia. This cruel irony isn't lost on Somalilanders. When it's convenient, the world treats them as separate, to send refugees back or to sign deals for port projects, but when it comes to awarding a seat at the table, the door is shut. In 2022, when Somalia's president hinted at resuming talks with Somaliland, talks that had started in 2012 in London and continued fitfully in Istanbul and Djibouti in subsequent years, Somaliland's response was consistent. We'll talk about two states, finding a way to collaborate, not about reunion. Hargeisa refuses any dialogue framework that suggests they are a subordinate region. For now, those talks have gone nowhere, especially after the Somalia-Somaliland talks were complicated by changing leadership in Mogadishu and the last Anod conflict. More on that soon. Despite the wall of non-recognition, Somaliland has accumulated a set of quasi-diplomatic relationships that give it the trappings of a recognized state in all but name. It has representative offices in a dozen countries, and conversely hosts a few foreign representative offices in Hargeisa. The neighbors take a pragmatic approach. Ethiopia has had a consulate in Hargeisa for years, staffed by a diplomat, issuing visas, facilitating trade, basically an embassy in all but title. Djibouti, Somaliland's tiny neighbor to the west, similarly keeps an office. Perhaps most controversially, Somaliland and Taiwan announced mutual representative offices in 2020, forging a friendship between two diplomatic orphans. In August 2020, Taiwan opened its office in Hargeisa, and Somaliland opened one in Taipei. This was done with full ceremony, flags displayed, though not at the UN, and officials calling it a win-win cooperation between two democratic partners. For Somaliland, it was a bold assertion of its foreign policy independence and a poke in the eye to Beijing. For Taiwan, it was a rare new formal tie, even if not using the word recognition. China reacted furiously, pressuring behind the scenes. Chinese envoys reportedly flew to Hargeisa to offer development projects, infrastructure, schools, roads, if Somaliland would drop the Taiwan deal. President Musa Bihi Abdi's administration rebuffed Beijing's overtures, a remarkable stance, given the potential money at stake. Bihi essentially said that Somaliland has the right to have friends of its choosing, implicitly equating China's attitude toward Taiwan with Somalia's attitude toward Somaliland in both cases, larger powers denying the smaller's agency. China, which backs Somalia's claim over Somaliland, was not amused, but short of rhetoric, there was little Beijing could do. One might speculate China increased support to Somalia's federal government or courted Somaliland's opposition behind closed doors as a countermove. The Somaliland-Taiwan partnership has since produced some concrete results. Taiwan set up agricultural demonstration projects and provided scholarships for students. It also donated some military jeeps to Somaliland's police. The two countries, to use their term, celebrate their shared political trajectory. Each sees in the other a mirror of its own struggle for recognition under the shadow of a much larger, hostile neighbor. As fate would have it, Somaliland's own political winds shifted in 2024 right after Taiwan found this ally. The new president, Abdirahman Iro, has signaled he may recalibrate some relationships. During the campaign, Iro hinted at evaluating the Taiwan ties more pragmatically. Some reports suggested he might be open to dialogue with China if Beijing could advance Somaliland's recognition or economic aims. This raised eyebrows in Taipei and among Somaliland's pro-Taiwan old guard. Iro, a seasoned politician and former Speaker of Parliament, is ultimately a nationalist. He will do what benefits Somaliland's quest for statehood. If that means engaging with China or engaging with Somalia's federal government anew, he might attempt it. But it's a delicate game. Somaliland's public is proud of their friendship with Taiwan. They see it as validation of their statehood and an alliance of fellow underdogs. Swinging toward China could be seen as selling out. Unless China offers the golden prize, recognition by some key countries or at least heavy investments without strings. Beijing's leverage is that it could, for instance, persuade African states to sponsor Somaliland's case at the AU if Somaliland cuts Taiwan ties, but whether China would do that is unclear, as it also wouldn't want to antagonize Somalia or set a precedent. If recognition remains out of reach via the AU or UN in the near term, Somaliland has explored other paths. One path is through strategic economic deals that entangle other countries' interests so deeply that eventually their political support must follow. The Berbera Port and Corridor project is exactly that kind of stratagem. By bringing in DP World, UAE, and giving Ethiopia a 19% stake in the port, Somaliland hooked big players. Ethiopia's stake, though Addis Ababa initially took long to pay its share, signaled a long-term commitment. Landlocked Ethiopia relies on Djibouti for over 90% of its trade, a situation Ethiopia hates because it gives tiny Djibouti outsized influence, and Djibouti's port fees cost Ethiopia about $1 billion a year. If Berbera can provide a second artery for Ethiopia's economy, that is transformative. Already, hundreds of Ethiopian trucks traverse the new corridor to Berbera each week, carrying commodities and construction materials. In January 2024, in a move that made Mogadishu see red, Somaliland under Muse Bihi signed a memorandum of understanding with Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed that included provisions for Ethiopia to formally recognize Somaliland in exchange for getting a lease to a plot of land on the Somaliland coast, effectively permission to establish an Ethiopian naval facility. The deal was quite audacious, a swap of recognition for a naval base. Ethiopia, long Africa's most populous landlocked country, has dreamed of having its own access to the sea. During the imperial days, Emperor Haile Selassie used to refer to the Red Sea as Ethiopia's seventh province. Now Abiy's government, forward-looking as it is, saw in Somaliland a potential ally to relieve dependence on Djibouti. The prospect of an Ethiopian naval base in Berbera, something that could materialize if Ethiopia rebuilds even a token navy, sent geopolitical ripples. Somalia's government was incensed, accusing Ethiopia of undermining Somali unity. Indeed, Somalia's President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed lodged a strong protest, and Somalia hinted it might downgrade ties with Addis. In response, interestingly, Somalia cozied up further to Ethiopia's rivals, courting Eritrea and Egypt, who have their own reasons to tweak Addis Ababa, the Nile Dam dispute, etc. Thus, Somaliland inadvertently became a pawn in the big Red Sea New Horn great game. The UAE, which already had a military foothold in Berbera, likely encouraged Somaliland's outreach to Ethiopia, aligning their two partners. For Somaliland, if Ethiopia, Africa's second most populous nation, were ever to formally recognize it, many smaller African countries might follow, providing cover under the principle of African solutions. Is such recognition likely? It's still a long shot. Ethiopia balances many concerns and officially supports Somalia's territorial integrity in regional forums. But Abiy's administration has been notably pragmatic and interest-driven. If Somaliland's value to Ethiopia's economy and security grows, Addis could one day spring a surprise by breaking ranks with the AU consensus. Some analysts think that if Somalia remains weak or hostile and Ethiopia's need for Red Sea access becomes critical, Ethiopia might be the first to cross the Rubicon and recognize Somaliland. Indeed, at least one former Ethiopian Prime Minister, Haile Mariam Desalegn, publicly advocated for Somaliland's recognition after leaving office. The other big external player is the United Arab Emirates, whose influence in Somaliland has grown significantly in the past decade. The UAE, through DP World, is pumping money into Berbera Port and a free trade zone that launched its first phase in 2021 to 2022. Berbera, once a sleepy port frequented by dhow traders and occasional livestock freighters, is now envisioned as a mini Dubai on the African coast. The UAE's motivations aren't purely commercial. Berbera sits strategically by the Bab el-Mandeb, the choke point to the Red Sea. Controlling or at least having access to ports along this route is key for the UAE's and Saudi Arabia's security. Think of the Yemen conflict and general Gulf rivalry with Iran, Turkey, Qatar for influence in the Horn. The UAE previously operated a major military base in Assab, Eritrea to conduct its Yemen war operations. It also had a small base in Mogadishu until relations with Somalia's former government soured in 2018. So it turned to Somaliland. In 2017 the UAE struck a deal with Somaliland to establish a military base at Berbera, alongside the port investment. Somalia's federal government loudly protested that this violated its sovereignty, but Somaliland and the UAE ignored the complaints. Construction of the UAE base began. A runway and facilities were built. However, by 2019 to 2020, as the UAE scaled down direct combat in Yemen, the base's status became a bit ambiguous. Reports in 2021 indicated the UAE closed its Assab base and was reconsidering Berbera. But by 2022, new reports, including satellite imagery analyses, suggested the Emirati base at Berbera was back under construction with a large airstrip and perimeter fences. The Sufyan Center noted that Emirati military presence in Berbera and Bosaso, Puntland, had helped combat piracy and monitor Iranian arms smuggling to Yemen. So the base appears to serve multiple purposes, part of the UAE security umbrella in the Red Sea and part of its network of logistical outposts. In 2023, unconfirmed rumors even swirled that Israel, which has warming ties with the UAE, might be allowed some access to Berbera for Red Sea monitoring, a sign of how geopolitically charged this spot is. For Somaliland, the UAE's deepening involvement is a double-edged sword that mostly cuts favorably. It means cash injections and a powerful friend who, if push came to shove, might at least advocate for Somaliland's interests in international halls. The UAE is influential with certain African and Middle Eastern states. Indeed, the UAE recently upgraded its diplomatic presence in Hargeisa, reportedly opening what is effectively an embassy, though quietly to avoid offending Somalia. And in mid-2022, when Somalia's then-President Farmajo was hostile to Somaliland and aligned with Qatar, Turkey, the UAE gave Somaliland a gift of COVID-19 aid and other support, pointedly to show it treats Somaliland separately. In 2025, the UAE went further. It brokered a $3 billion investment to build a railway from Berbera into Ethiopia. That railway, announced during President Iro's visit to Abu Dhabi in early 2025, will run over 250 kilometers from Berbera to Togwajale at the Ethiopian border. If completed, it cements the Berbera corridor as a permanent fixture, not just a road but a steel artery. The railway would slash transport costs for Ethiopian trade, which as noted currently bleeds $1 billion in fees to Djibouti. For Somaliland, it would be transformative, job creation, easier movement of goods, and likely millions in transit fees bolstering state revenue. The UAE paying the full bill, $3 billion, underscores how strategically it views Somaliland's location. This convergence of interests among Somaliland, Ethiopia, and the UAE is creating a new geopolitical bloc on the Red Sea's southern coast. Each gets something. Somaliland gets development and quasi-recognition through partnerships. Ethiopia inches closer to the sea outlet it craves. The UAE secures influence at a key maritime node and a friendly port for its navy or logistics. All these maneuvers, of course, further irritate Somalia's federal government. For Mogadishu, Somaliland's deals with foreign powers are seen as illegal and treasonous, since they insist Somaliland is just a region. But Somalia has had to pick its battles. It already quarreled with the UAE and lost out on that relationship, and it can't afford to alienate Ethiopia, which is a crucial military ally against Al-Shabaab. Thus, Somalia issues condemnations and occasionally tries to get the Arab League or others to censure Somaliland's unilateral engagements, but so far that hasn't achieved much. Interestingly, some in Mogadishu's elite privately concede that Somaliland's stability is beneficial, even if they won't ever say it openly. A stable north, not harboring extremists and even providing a trade route for the region, is good for everyone. The disagreement is only about flags and anthems, albeit deeply emotional symbols. Periodically, Somalia and Somaliland have engaged in talks about their future relationship, e.g., in 2012 in London, 2014 in Turkey, 2015-16 in Djibouti, but these talks stall because Somaliland insists on independence while Somalia offers autonomy at most. The international community tries to phrase it as dialogue on future arrangements without prejudging outcome, but practically it's a deadlock. Perhaps pragmatic cooperation will continue under the table, for example, managing airspace. Until recently, international airspace for Somalia and Somaliland was handled by the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. In 2018, an agreement was reached to transfer control to Somalia but with some revenue share to Somaliland. Or consider currency. Somaliland uses its own shilling, Somalia its own, newly reissued, shilling. There has been coordination to avoid flooding each other's currency illegally across the border. These technical issues see quiet collaboration even absent political recognition. One place where the fiction of a unitary Somalia truly breaks down, however, is on the battlefield in Somaliland's east. The regions of Sool and eastern Sanaag have long been contested between Somaliland and the semi-autonomous Somali state of Puntland. These areas are inhabited by clans, notably the Dhulbahante and Warsangeli. who have historically been ambivalent about Somaliland's project. They didn't feel as marginalized by Bar, and some prefer the idea of a federal Somalia, especially if they fear Azark clan domination in Somaliland. The result has been a frozen dispute that occasionally melts into violence. The city of Las Anod in Sul is the flashpoint. Somaliland has administered Las Anod since around 2007, after shoving Puntland forces out, but the local population's loyalties have been split. In late 2022, Las Anod erupted in protests after a local opposition politician was assassinated. It was unclear by whom. Public anger, fueled by years of perceived neglect and political marginalization, turned against the Somaliland authorities. What started as demonstrations turned into deadly clashes. Somaliland's army and local clan militias exchanged gunfire in the streets of Las Anod. Over a few horrific weeks, dozens of civilians were killed in crossfire, and an estimated 185,000 people fled the city and its environs, figures reported by aid agencies, essentially emptying Las Anod of much of its population. By early 2023, local clan leaders, Dulbahante, declared they did not recognize Somaliland's rule and announced the formation of a regional administration called SSC Katumo, aligned with Somalia. Somaliland's government, viewing this as a secession within a secession, declared the move treasonous and sent more troops. Intense fighting ensued in February-March 2023, turning Las Anod into a war zone with mortars and machine guns in the streets where just months prior students had been taking exams. The city acquired that thin, devouring quiet that attaches itself to places where neighbors shoot at each other, one witness reported grimly. By August 2023, Somaliland's forces had pulled back to the outskirts after failing to secure the town. Front lines froze in a tense stalemate with Somaliland controlling the periphery and SSC clan militia holding Las Anod proper. Ceasefires were attempted and broken. The human toll, dozens if not hundreds dead, including civilians, and deep bitterness, was a heavy new burden on Somaliland's conscience. Everyone lost something that cannot be itemized, a local elder said, referring to the shattered trust and the graves now dotting once peaceful neighborhoods. For Somaliland, the Las Anod conflict is a painful contradiction. A state that prided itself on peace and consensus now finds itself accused of occupation by some of its own people. The government in Hargeisa insists it has historical right to Sul, as part of the British boundaries, and that Al-Shabaab and Puntland are instigating trouble. But the reality is, Somaliland faces an insurgency of a sort, one tied up with clanism and the unresolved question of Somali identity. How Somaliland handles this will shape its moral case for independence. If it doubles down on force, it risks undermining the very principles of voluntary union and self-determination it claims in breaking from Somalia. If it lets Sul go, it loses territory and faces internal political backlash from nationalists. So far, they've chosen a hard line, but maybe the new President Iro will seek a fresh approach, perhaps genuine dialogue with Sul's leaders, something Bihi refused. Despite these internal strains, Somaliland's overall trajectory remains one of perseverance. At 30-plus years of self-rule, it has lasted longer than the Somali Union did, 1960 to 1991. The what if looms large. What if Somaliland never reunited with Somalia in 1960? Would it have avoided the civil war altogether? Such musings aside, Somaliland today finds itself in an unprecedented situation in the 21st century, a country that exists in every practical sense yet remains in diplomatic limbo. It is Africa's great paradox. On a continent where colonial borders were supposed to be sacrosanct, here is a state attempting to restore a colonial border and being told no. So Somaliland navigates the world through creativity and stubbornness. Its passport isn't accepted for visas, so many Somalilanders travel on dual nationality or Somali passports, but when they come home, they line up proudly in a separate queue at Hargeisa Airport for Somaliland passport holders. Its currency isn't recognized, so it embraces digital dollars and hawala, turning a weakness into innovation. It cannot sign treaties, so it signs memorandums of understanding and agreements, like the recent UAE and Ethiopia MOUs, which in effect act like treaties. It cannot join the IMF, so it teaches itself fiscal discipline. Somaliland has had balanced budgets or small deficits almost every year, simply because overspending beyond revenue isn't an option when no one will lend you money. It also means Somaliland has zero external debt, a rarity in Africa, a fact officials tout to investors. When asked what keeps Somaliland going despite all the snubs and setbacks, an elder statesman once said, "We have two things, belief in our right, and patience." Those two are anchored in almost every Somali concept of virtue. One might think the younger generation, with no memory of the 1980s atrocities, would lose that patience or feel less strongly about independence. But interestingly, a 2020 survey by the Rift Valley Institute found over 90% of Somaliland's youth still supported independence, virtually the same as their parents. The narrative of a just cause, of a small nation that did everything right, democratized, kept peace, built institutions, and is still denied its seat, resonates deeply. It also helps that Somaliland has cultivated a civic nationalism that transcends clan to a notable degree. The flag, green, white, and red with the black star and the Islamic Sharia inscription, is seen everywhere. Schoolchildren can draw it from memory. Independence Day on the 18th of May is celebrated with fervor usually reserved for World Cup victories, dancing in the streets, flags draped as capes, parades of every social group. It's a conscious effort to forge national identity where clan identity could easily dominate. Even the clans in Seoul who resist Somaliland's authority do not dispute the unique history of British Somaliland. Their objections are more about power distribution in Hargeisa than about being Somali or Somalilander. In casual conversation, one often hears, in Somalia this, but in Somaliland that, as if they were as separate as France and Spain. The word, Somalia, in Somaliland discourse has come to mean only the southern neighbor. A tour through Hargeisa's modest national archives reveals carefully preserved documents, the 1960 letters of recognition from countries like Israel, Ethiopia, and others that briefly acknowledge the state of Somaliland in that 5-day window. Archivists show them to visitors as proof. See, the world knew us once. It's heartbreaking in a way. The world did note Somaliland's independence on June 26, 1960, only to pretend after 1991 that it never existed as a separate entity. A scholar once commented that Somaliland is a country that international society accidentally colonized twice, first by the British, and then by Somalia. By this logic, Somaliland's struggle is anti-colonial at its core, just that the colonizer was a pan-Somali nationalist state that failed them. This argument finds sympathetic ears in some corners of Africa. For instance, South Africa and Ghana reportedly have given private nods that Somaliland's case is unique, though they stop short of breaking ranks publicly. Meanwhile, Somaliland's people carry on building their nation in practical ways. A popular civic motto is, Kudiso, build it. They build schools. With diaspora funding, every region now has new primary and secondary schools and at least one university campus. They built hospitals. Famously, Edna Odonismail, the former foreign minister and indefatigable 86-year-old, built a maternity hospital in 2002 by selling her own house and pouring her life savings into it. Edna Odon Maternity Hospital, opened with just 25 beds, has since trained over 1,000 nurses and midwives and delivered over 20,000 babies, slashing maternal and infant mortality in Somaliland. Edna, often called the mother of Somaliland, remains a living symbol of what self-reliance can achieve. She likes to tell visitors, we did this because no one else would do it for us. We saved ourselves. In 2020, when COVID-19 struck, Somaliland set up its own quarantine centers and awareness campaigns swiftly, even as it struggled to get vaccines allocated, since officially vaccines had to come through the Somalia government via COVAX. Again, diaspora doctors and local nurses teamed up, and Somaliland managed relatively well. As one walks around Hargeisa today, the scar of war is still evident in the form of bombed-out shells of buildings left as memorials, but right next to them might be a new story building financed by diaspora money. Internet cafes, solar street lights, a lively radio and TV scene. There are numerous Somaliland-based TV channels and independent newspapers. The atmosphere is of a society that has decided to act as if it is free, even if the world hasn't signed the certificate. This has even extended to cultural spheres. For instance, Somaliland held its own book fairs and poetry festivals throughout the 2010s, spearheaded by young intellectuals keen to carve out a distinct literary voice. The late poet Gari and songwriter Hadrawi, often called the Shakespeare of Somalia, hailed from Somaliland. When Hadrawi died in August 2022, Somaliland held a state funeral that brought thousands to tears. Men openly wept in public squares hearing his verses broadcast, a cultural catharsis that one could argue is part of nation building too, binding people through shared mourning of a poetic icon. Even in sports, an arena of identity, Somaliland asserts itself. It has a national football team, unrecognized by FIFA of course, that plays in alternative tournaments for stateless peoples. It even won a match against an unofficial Tibesti, Saharan, team in a tournament in London. But Somalilanders also cheer for Somalia's team when it's playing internationally, a reminder that ethnic bonds aren't totally severed by politics. Perhaps nothing captures the ambiguity better than the story of Sir Mo Farah. The Olympic champion runner, long a British citizen, revealed in July 2022 that his real name is Hussein Abdi Karim and that he was trafficked as a child from Somaliland to the UK. This caused a stir in Britain, but in Somaliland it caused a different reaction. People were proud that one of ours had achieved greatness, yet his backstory of being undocumented and vulnerable resonated deeply. In Hajiz's tea shops, men discussed not the shock of him being trafficked. Sadly, many knew of similar cases, but whether the British authorities would now treat him differently or possibly help more Somaliland kids. The Horn of Africa press shrugged that of course Mo Farah was originally from Somaliland. It was almost a boast. When Farah's story came out, Somaliland's government publicly invited him to visit his true home. It was as if Somaliland the ghost was saying, "We see you, Mo, even if the world saw only Britain." Farah's response was heartfelt. He said he owed his life to the people who helped him, but acknowledged his roots. In a way, his saga illustrates diaspora identity, legally Somali, perhaps under British law then, factually Somaliland, effectively British. And as that news cycle ended, Somalilanders returned to their primary task, as an editorial cartoon put it, making a home safe for the next Mo Farah so he won't need to be trafficked. As we look to the future, the stakes around Somaliland are only growing. The Red Sea corridor is becoming a contested arena with global powers establishing bases, the US, China, France, Turkey all present in the neighborhood. If Somaliland is recognized, it would immediately become a strategic partner for many. Perhaps that's one reason some players hesitate, since it would upset the current balance where Djibouti is the default hub. For the Gulf states, Somaliland's coast is a real estate of opportunity. The UAE already in Berbera, Qatar reportedly sniffing around to counter UAE, even Turkey, which runs a big base and training mission in Mogadishu, has tried to engage Hajizas softly, e.g., offering medical aid, to not be left out. Israel has quietly engaged Somaliland too. A delegation of Jewish American investors visited in 2020, and speculation was that Israel sees a friendly Muslim enclave that might one day join the Abraham Accords bandwagon if it splits from Somalia, which is more closely tied to Arab League positions. Somaliland navigates these waters carefully. It doesn't want to become a pawn in others' chess games, though to some extent it already is. It strives to adhere to a policy of positive neutrality, reminiscent of how small states survived the Cold War. But neutrality doesn't preclude pragmatism. Somaliland will take help from anyone who offers it without strings that threaten its autonomy. In recent years, Kenya, itself having a delicate relationship with Somalia, has warmed to Somaliland, seeing potential trade and a fellow democracy. In 2022, Kenya even allowed direct flights from Hargeisa to Nairobi for a trial period and hosted a Somaliland delegation, causing Mogadishu to protest and temporarily cut ties with Nairobi. Many African diplomats see Somaliland as a curiosity, privately admirable, publicly untouchable. The African Union as an institution remains the toughest nut. Unless a heavyweight like Ethiopia or South Africa champions Somaliland, the AU is likely to stick to status quo. What does Somaliland itself seek ultimately? Not absorption into a greater Somalia that ships sailed with the war. Not isolation either, it wants to join the world formally. One can foresee a few scenarios, a Kosovo-like partial recognition, where a bunch of willing nations extend recognition even if UN membership is blocked by a veto or AU non-consensus, or a Hong Kong-like special status, short of independence but highly autonomous with international economic integration, or the long game where Somaliland simply continues to build facts on the ground until perhaps Somalia itself fractures or agrees to a velvet divorce. The new President Iro has indicated his priority is economic development, so that the world has no excuse to ignore us, implying he'll double down on making Somaliland a success story. The Berbera corridor, new investments, and an anti-corruption drive are on his agenda. He also faces the immediate challenge of resolving Las Anod's conflict. He has hinted he might seek more dialogue with the dissident clans there, even as he reiterates Somaliland's territorial integrity. For the ordinary Somalilander, day-to-day life is not consumed by the recognition question. They wake up, pray, go to work, worry about school fees or the price of sugar, chat about English Premier League matches in the evening like people anywhere. The state functions enough that you can get a driver's license, register a land title, with some bribes perhaps, sue a neighbor in court, and trust that a contract will hold more often than not. These mundane things are actually astounding achievements given the anarchy next door for so long. The contrast with Somalia is the unspoken proof Somalilanders offer. Look at Bosaso or Mogadishu, then look at Berbera or Hargeisa. Indeed, for much of the 2010s, international media frequently described Somaliland as an oasis of peace in a chaotic region. It wasn't hyperbole. Hargeysa's crime rate was lower than Minneapolis's. Tourists, yes, a trickle of actual tourists, began to come, drawn by the last Jill cave paintings, a magnificent set of Neolithic rock art outside Hargeisa that survived precisely because the area was safe to visit. Diaspora members started businesses, hotels, tech startups, fisheries in Berbera. The economy grew around 8% annually in the late 2010s, from a low base, but still notable. All this while carrying the handicap of non-recognition. To maintain this in the future, Somaliland knows it must keep a delicate balance. It needs to keep delivering basic decency to its people, the two decencies, one writer said carried it this far: public discussion and public services. That means continuing its tradition of resolving disputes through dialogue, the shoe instead of the summit, as they say, implying horizontal, community-based diplomacy rather than top-down. It also means literally keeping the lights on, the water flowing, the roads passable, the boring stuff that actually underpins legitimacy. Somaliland's government spends the majority of its budget on security and administration, but there is a push to invest more in education and infrastructure. They have no choice but to be lean. Every civil servant's salary and every school textbook must come from that limited $500 million budget or donor NGOs. Corruption exists but has been markedly less than in Somalia. One reason is that all eyes are on the limited pie, and whistleblowers do emerge, especially since free media is active. The press in Somaliland is freer than in many African countries, though not without issues. Journalists have been arrested for sowing division at times, but they also routinely criticize the president and expose graft without being disappeared, a non-trivial freedom in the region. As the Horn of Africa enters a new era, with Ethiopia undergoing great changes, Eritrea re-emerging from isolation, Gulf countries asserting influence, and global competition rising, Somaliland's status becomes more than a local quirk, it's a linchpin. If Somaliland were recognized, it could join the international community's efforts on Red Sea security formally. It's already done informally. It could sign treaties to protect its rich fisheries from foreign poaching. Currently foreign trawlers sometimes exploit its UN-policed waters. It could access financing to upgrade its energy grid or adapt to climate change. Conversely, if Somaliland were to somehow falter or be dragged into a wider conflict, say an Ethiopian civil strife spillover or a confrontation with Puntland escalating, the whole Red Sea corridor could see instability affecting shipping lanes where 1/10 of the world's trade passes. So far, Somaliland's existence has arguably been a net positive for regional stability. It provided Ethiopia a secondary outlet, it created a zone where Western interests, counter-terror, anti-piracy, had a reliable partner, and it gave Somalis an example of bottom-up peace. Some analysts warn, though, that prolonged non-recognition carries risk. The younger generation might tire of no rewards for their democracy. External actors could exploit the limbo, for instance, extremist groups or unscrupulous businesses taking advantage of legal grey zones. Already, the lack of recognition ties the hands of Somaliland's authorities in many ways, preventing them from fully engaging in reconstruction and development. Somaliland has a saying, Huyadi wax dashe we la aka, Huyadi dabid jabasena lama ako. You see the mother who gave birth to something good, but you don't see the one who caused a miscarriage. It's a folksy way of noting that success has many fathers, failure is an orphan. Somaliland feels it has succeeded in giving birth to a peaceful state, yet the world acts almost as if that success is inconvenient, preferring not to acknowledge it lest it upset some order. But it's hard to imagine Somaliland simply giving up and rejoining Somalia. Too much blood and effort consecrate its path. As the decades pass, recognition may become a mere formality in the sense that Somaliland is, for all intents, living as if it's recognized. When you land at Berbera's modernized airport, built with Kuwaiti aid, and present your Somaliland passport for a visa stamp, no Somali official is anywhere in sight. The flag flying is Somaliland's, the anthem playing on the terminal speakers is Samo Kuwa, may you live in peace. Foreigners arriving on a rare international flight, from Dubai, say, technically have entered Somalia in the eyes of international law, but in practice they go through Somaliland immigration and customs. It's a make-believe charade that everyone tacitly agrees to. In a final analysis, Somaliland stands as a testament to the idea that state legitimacy comes not from international conferences but from streets and villages deciding to govern themselves. It asks the world to reconsider rigid notions of sovereignty. After all, if states are about serving their people, Somaliland has done so against all odds, while Somalia failed to do so and had to be put back together with massive foreign intervention. The African Union in 2005 concluded that Somaliland's case was sufficiently sui generis that recognizing it should not be linked with opening Pandora's box of other separatist claims. That conclusion sits gathering dust, but it could be a foundation if any African leadership dared to act on it. Perhaps Somaliland's best hope is incremental. An African state here or there starts informal recognition. For instance, one rumor is that Kenya or Ghana might be the first to openly break ranks in coming years, especially if prompted by some diplomatic tiff with Somalia. Or maybe a major power, tired of waiting for Mogadishu-Hargeisa reconciliation, extends bilateral recognition. Imagine the United States or UK doing so, after intense lobbying by Somaliland's diaspora and sympathetic legislators. Indeed, the UK Parliament held debates in 2022 and 2023 where MPs from all parties urged HMG to recognise Somaliland, arguing that Britain had a historical responsibility since it was the colonial ruler and since Somaliland meets the criteria of statehood. The UK government's response was cautious but telling: "We admire Somaliland's progress, but recognition would have to be an African-led decision." Translation: "We won't stick our necks out first." In the US, a similar sentiment is growing. A 2022 congressional bill proposed to explore closer ties with Somaliland, even considering a security partnership, not full recognition, but stepping that direction. Meanwhile, Somaliland soldiers will continue to salute their flag each morning at bases outside Hargeisa. Civil servants will continue to stamp forms with the Republic of Somaliland crest. Schoolchildren will memorize the dates: the 26th of June, 1960, independence, and the 18th of May, 1991, restoration, as twin birthdays of their nation. And Somaliland's leaders will continue to send envoys to every Afro-Arab meeting, every UN sideline, carrying thick briefing books of facts and figures, making the legal case, the moral case, the pragmatic case. They often conclude their presentations with a simple plea: "We have been independent for 30 years and more, we ask only that you acknowledge what we are." Thus far, that plea has been met with shifting eyes and diplomatic doublespeak. But they persist. After all, it took Eritrea almost 30 years of armed struggle and a referendum to get recognition in 1993, and interestingly, Somaliland supported Eritrea's bid back then. South Sudan's recognition in 2011 also came after protracted war and negotiation. Somaliland's path has been peaceful and democratic. One might say that's a harder sell in a cynical world. But perhaps that very contrast will eventually shame enough actors into action. For now, Somaliland carries on building the reality it wants the world to see. In a sense, it behaves like a quantum state in physics, existing and not existing depending on the observer. But inside the borders, there is no doubt, Somaliland knows it exists. A visitor might notice an emblem emblazoned on government buildings, a durbar, meeting circle, under an acacia tree, encircled by the words, Allah Ma'adle, thanks be to God. That emblem symbolizes the Shah, council, that birthed the nation and the faith that kept it alive. It's on the Somaliland shilling notes and on the official seal. It is a reminder that Somaliland's legitimacy sprouts from its own soil, under its own acacias where elders and citizens forged a pact. The world can choose to join that pact, or ignore it a while longer. But on the ground, Somalilanders often invoke a proverb: "Run siyasat kama bikto," truth doesn't fear politics. The truth in their eyes is that Somaliland is already a state. And so they alphabetize the future, ministry by ministry, waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. In the meantime, they will keep the goats flowing, the phones ringing, the port cranes swinging, quietly confident that sooner or later, history will vindicate their long endeavor to live in eternal peace. Samoku War.